Jack Lawson never imagined that the biggest threat to his farm wouldn't be droughts, market crashes, or even a bad growing season, but a homeowners association run by a woman who considered fresh manure a crime against humanity. Sunset Valley Farm had been in Jack's family since 1957, back when his grandfather paid for the land in cash, built the first barn with his own 2 hands, and carved out a life from the soil. His father expanded the acreage during the boom years, and when Jack took over in 2005, he made a promise to keep the farm running no matter what. It wasn't just land. It was history, sweat, and sacrifice. Every fence post and furrow had a story behind it, stories that the people across the road couldn't possibly understand. 2 years ago, everything changed. That was when the developers broke ground on Lakeview Estates, a high-end suburban neighborhood promising luxury country living. 48 nearly identical houses, each starting at $450,000, rose from the dirt like weeds, with manicured lawns, automated sprinkler systems, and not a speck of real country in sight. They called it Lakeview, even though there wasn't a lake within 20 miles. The developers had promised seamless integration with the surrounding countryside, but Jack knew what that really meant. The new homeowners expected the countryside to change for them, not the other way around. And leading that charge was Vicki Caldwell. She moved into Lakeview Estates 3 months after the first homes sold. Mid-50s, perfectly styled blonde bob, a brand new white RAV4 with custom plates that read HOA for life. Within a month, she'd maneuvered her way into the HOA president seat, and within 2, she had turned her attention to the one thing she considered an eyesore, the farm Jack had spent his whole life working to keep alive. The complaints started small. First, it was the roosters crowing too early. Then, the smell of manure on fertilizing days. The dust from the combine during harvest. At first, Jack humored them. He adjusted his schedule, spreading manure when the wind was blowing away from their homes. He invited them to a community barbecue, offered fresh produce, tried to show them that the farm wasn't just a piece of land, it was a way of life. Some of the new neighbors appreciated it. They stopped by, shook his hand, thanked him for the tomatoes and sweet corn. But not Vicki. "This is the 21st century, Mr. Lawson," she told him one afternoon, standing just past his fence line with her arms crossed like she was scolding a misbehaving child. "People want clean air and picturesque views, not dust, animal waste, and outdated farming methods. Perhaps it's time you considered retirement. The development company is very interested in acquiring properties like yours." Jack had heard enough. "I'm not selling," he said flatly, gripping the worn edge of the fence post. Vicki gave him a knowing smile, the kind that made Jack's stomach turn. "Well," she said, adjusting the oversized HOA badge clipped to her blouse. "Let's see how long you can hold out." Jack wasn't a man who spooked easy. He had weathered floods, market crashes, and long nights wondering if the next season's yield would be enough to keep the farm running. But as the weeks went by, it became clear that Vicki Caldwell wasn't just another pushy neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was a force of disruption, and she wasn't going to stop until Sunset Valley Farm was gone. At first, it was just the usual HOA nonsense, formal complaint letters about agricultural disturbances left in his mailbox, condescending emails about how his equipment was an unsightly blight on the neighborhood's aesthetic, and HOA meetings where she listed his farm as a significant concern on the agenda. But then, the complaints started coming from places beyond the HOA. One morning, Jack was out feeding the cattle when a white truck pulled up to his gate. The man who stepped out was wearing an official-looking badge that read Environmental Protection Agency, Inspection Division. "We received a complaint about potential water contamination from your runoff," the inspector said, adjusting his clipboard. Jack frowned, wiping his hands on his jeans. "From who?" The man hesitated. It was an anonymous report. But the details were thorough. Jack knew exactly who was behind it. He led the inspector through his property, showing him the irrigation ditches, the containment measures, the careful planning that ensured nothing from his farm was harming the local water supply. The inspector nodded, took notes, and left without issuing any citations. But it wasn't the last visit. A week later, an animal welfare officer showed up, claiming that multiple concerns had been raised about his livestock. Then came the county zoning board, investigating a public nuisance complaint about excessive odors and air quality violations. Each time, Jack cooperated. Each time, they found nothing wrong. And each time, he got the same vague answer. The reports were anonymous, but very detailed. The final straw came when he got a call from his biggest supplier, a company he had been working with for over 15 years. "Jack, we're getting a lot of bad press," the supplier said, his voice uneasy. "Some reports about unsafe conditions on your farm. We know it's probably nonsense, but corporate's getting nervous. We're going to have to pause orders until this clears up." Jack barely heard the rest of the conversation. His hands clenched into fists as he stared out at his fields, the land his grandfather had broken his back to cultivate, the land his father had expanded and fought to keep. This wasn't just about complaints anymore. Vicky was trying to ruin him. That was when he started asking around. A few conversations with local officials confirmed what he already suspected. Vicky Caldwell had been making calls. She had personally lobbied county commissioners, sent long-winded emails to environmental agencies, and pressured local businesses to distance themselves from the farm. Jack wasn't a man who picked fights. But this wasn't a fight. This was war. Then came the Facebook posts. Jack had never paid much attention to social media, but when his neighbor Mike Reynolds stopped by with his phone out, shaking his head, Jack knew something was wrong. "Have you seen this?" Mike asked, handing over the phone. Jack squinted at the screen. The HOA's Facebook page was filled with photo after photo of his farm, angled just right to make it look run down, overgrown, and unkempt. The captions were worse. "Is this the kind of environment we want our children growing up next to? An eyesore that's lowering all of our property values. Unacceptable agricultural hazards, action must be taken." And the worst one, posted by Vicky herself. "We all moved here to enjoy the beauty of the countryside, not to be surrounded by outdated, hazardous farming methods. Change is coming." The comments were a mix of HOA members agreeing and longtime locals pushing back, defending Jack and his farm. But the damage was already done. A local news outlet had picked up the story, publishing an article titled, "Growing Concerns, Local Farm Faces Scrutiny Over Environmental and Community Complaints." Jack's heart pounded as he read the article. It painted him as some kind of reckless farmer, ignoring regulations, harming the environment, and refusing to work with the community to improve conditions. It even quoted Vicky, ***, "We've tried to reason with Mr. Lawson, but he refuses to cooperate. At this point, we may have no choice but to escalate through legal channels." Legal channels. Jack slammed the phone onto the counter so hard that Mike flinched. "This woman is trying to take my damn farm." Mike exhaled sharply. "And she's doing a hell of a job making you the bad guy." Jack took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't about to roll over. But before he could figure out his next move, Vicky made hers. The next day, she trespassed onto his property. Jack was out fertilizing his north fields, the ones closest to Lake View Estates, when he spotted the white RAV4 parked right in the middle of his crops. His stomach twisted. It wasn't on the access road. It wasn't near the fence line. It was deep in his field, tires crushing young seedlings. And there, walking through the rows of corn like she owned the place, was Vicky Caldwell. She was holding her phone up, taking photos. And then, right in front of him, she bent down, grabbed a handful of seedlings, and stuffed them into plastic bags. Jack's blood ran hot. He drove his tractor toward her, jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. "Vicky," he called out, trying to keep his voice even. "You're trespassing. And your car is damaging my crops." She barely even looked up from her phone. "Documenting environmental hazards," she said, snapping another picture. "The HOA board is building a case to present to the county next week." Jack's patience was hanging by a thread. "I'm telling you to leave. Now." Vicky waved him off like he was a farmhand, dismissive, arrogant. "I'll leave when I have enough evidence." Jack's hands clenched around the steering wheel. Then, he noticed something in the sky. A small, buzzing sound. Up above them, hovering about 100 feet in the air, was a drone. Jack recognized it immediately, **** Ethan Carter's drone, ****. Ethan, the 17-year-old kid who lived on the next farm over, was always flying that thing, capturing footage of the countryside for his school projects. And right now, it was pointed directly at Vicky. Something in Jack shifted. A calm, focused kind of anger. Vicky thought she was untouchable. She thought she could manipulate, threaten, and trespass without consequences. She thought she could destroy his way of life. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. Jack sat in the cab of his tractor, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He had spent his life following the rules, being a good neighbor, and turning the other cheek when people tried to push him around. But this? This was different. Vicky Caldwell wasn't just a nuisance, she was actively trying to take his land, and now, she was standing in his field, ripping up his crops, acting like she had every right to be there. His father's voice echoed in his mind, that calm, measured wisdom he'd grown up with. "Never burn a bridge you might need to cross later, son." But Jack wasn't about to cross any bridges. Vicky was setting them all on fire. He exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking to the drone overhead. Ethan's drone. The kid had no idea what he'd just stumbled into, but it was exactly what Jack needed. Jack climbed down from the tractor, not taking his eyes off the woman still moving through his field. "Vicky, I'm telling you one last time, get off my land." She sighed dramatically, as if she were the one being inconvenienced. "Mr. Lawson, you have no legal right to keep me from documenting violations. Your practices are outdated, and the county needs to see what's really going on here." She turned her back on him and knelt down again, stuffing another handful of seedlings into a plastic bag. Jack clenched his fists. That was it. Jack turned on his heel and walked straight back toward the barn, his mind already made up. He didn't hesitate. Didn't second-guess himself. He knew exactly what he was about to do. In the back of the barn, sitting exactly where it always was his front-end loader. And sitting in the loader, steaming in the afternoon heat, was 2 tons of fresh manure. The rich, pungent smell filled his nostrils as he climbed into the cab. He'd mucked out the barn that morning and hadn't had a chance to spread it yet. Now he had the perfect place for it. Jack backed the tractor up, lifting the bucket high. The weight of the manure made the hydraulics groan, and as he rolled back toward the north field, he could see Vicky still there, still oblivious. She had moved toward her RAV4, standing near the open trunk, rearranging the stolen plants like they were pieces of evidence in a court case she was planning to win. Jack parked the tractor 50 feet away from her, letting the machine idle loudly. Vicky finally turned, her expression shifting from smugness to mild irritation. "Are you seriously doing this right now?" she scoffed, holding up her phone as if recording him would somehow make her the victim in all of this. Jack leaned forward, resting his forearm on the steering wheel. "I'm giving you 30 seconds, Vicky. Move your car. Get off my land." She smirked, completely unfazed. "Or what?" Jack nudged the tractor forward, just enough to send a warning message. Vicky took a step back but didn't stop recording. "This is exactly the kind of threatening behavior we've documented," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The commissioner is going to love this. Jack tilted his head, as if considering his next move. 15 seconds. She laughed, actually laughed. You wouldn't dare, she said, taking another step back toward her car. Jack pulled the lever. 2 tons of steaming, freshly mucked manure cascaded down from the bucket in a slow-motion wave of poetic justice. The first splatter hit the roof of the RAV4, sending a thick, wet slap echoing through the field. The rest followed in a heavy, unrelenting avalanche, covering the entire car from roof to wheels. The open trunk filled instantly, manure oozing into the expensive carpeting. The driver's side door, still ajar, took a direct hit, sending thick brown sludge seeping into the leather seats, the dashboard, the gearshift. Vicky's scream could have shattered glass. She dropped her phone into the manure pile at her feet and stumbled backward, gagging. You. Jack sat calmly in his tractor, watching the absolute meltdown happening before him. You destroyed my car, she shrieked, arms flailing. This is assault. This is vandalism. I'm calling the police. Jack shrugged, tilting his head toward the mess. Just spreading fertilizer, Vicky. Like I've been doing for 15 years. Not my fault you parked where I was working. Vicky was seething. She looked down at herself, her once pristine blouse and slacks streaked with brown smears. The smell must have hit her fully, because she gagged again, covering her mouth. This isn't over, she spat, stumbling toward the farmhouse. I'm using your phone to call the sheriff, and then I'm suing you for everything you own. Jack just leaned back in his seat, watching her stomp away, leaving manure-covered footprints in her wake. And then, off in the distance, he saw Ethan Carter standing near the equipment shed, holding his drone controller. The kid lifted one hand and gave a slow, approving thumbs up. Jack exhaled, a small smirk creeping onto his face. That footage was going to come in handy. Jack barely had time to enjoy the satisfaction of watching Vicky Caldwell stomp off toward his house, dripping with manure, before the storm truly hit. Within an hour, Sunset Valley Farm turned into the center of a full-blown spectacle. First came the sirens. 2 sheriff's deputies rolled up, parking their cruisers along the fence line just as Vicky, now wrapped in a clean sweatshirt someone had brought her, dramatically pointed toward Jack like she was identifying a suspect in a lineup. That's him, she hissed, her voice shaking with righteous fury. That man assaulted me with biological waste. He deliberately damaged my property. I want him arrested. Jack didn't flinch as Sheriff Dan Mitchell stepped out of his car. He'd known the sheriff since they were kids. His father had bought hay from Jack's grandfather, and Dan had spent a few summers helping with the harvest back in high school. He wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions, but even he had a hard time keeping a straight face as he looked at Vicky, covered in dried manure, and then at her RAV4, which was still leaking brown sludge from the interior. Jack, Dan said, scratching the back of his head, please tell me you didn't do exactly what I think you did. Jack crossed his arms. She parked on my field. I was spreading fertilizer. She didn't move. Dan sighed, rubbing his temples. She says you dumped it on purpose. Jack raised a brow. And I say she was trespassing, damaging my crops, and stealing plants out of my field. That RAV4 didn't just end up in the middle of my farm, Dan. She drove it in there, and I've got the crushed seedlings to prove it. Vicky let out a high-pitched scoff. That's ridiculous. I was collecting evidence. He's been polluting the air and contaminating the soil for years. We have an environmental consultant reviewing samples. Jack barely contained his laugh. You mean the ones you pulled out of my ground while trespassing? Yeah, good luck with that. Before Vicky could fire back, a new voice cut in. I've got something to add to that discussion. Jack turned. Standing just behind the deputies was Ethan Carter, holding his drone controller with a quiet confidence that made Jack's stomach twist with anticipation. Dan looked over at the kid. Ethan, this isn't the time for. The teenager didn't back down. "Actually, Sheriff, I think you're gonna want to see this." He tapped his phone screen, and a video began playing. Jack folded his arms as he watched the drone footage, crystal clear, high definition, with audio. It showed everything: Vicky's arrival, the way she drove deep into Jack's field, how she deliberately pulled up crops while smirking to herself, the moment she made a phone call and said, "If we push hard enough, we can claim health violations and force the rezoning." And then, the most damning piece of all, Vicky moving her car closer after seeing Jack fertilizing, parking directly in the work zone before continuing to document evidence. Silence settled over the group as the footage ended. Dan exhaled slowly. "Well, damn." Vicky's expression twisted into something ugly. That's manipulated. That doesn't prove anything." Dan turned to his deputy. "Mark, do me a favor and pull up the trespassing statute." Jack allowed himself the smallest of smirks. Vicky wasn't done fighting. By the next morning, her lawyer had already sent a cease and desist letter demanding Jack pay for the damage to her car, plus $75,000 in damages for emotional distress and lost wages. A legal fund was started by the HOA, turning this into a full-blown suburban versus rural war. But Jack had no intention of backing down. His lawyer, Ed Walker, took one look at the footage and let out a low whistle. "Well, Jack, you just turned this whole thing on its head. What are our options?" Jack asked, leaning over the desk. Ed grinned. "We countersue. Trespassing. Crop damage. False accusations. Hell, we could even throw in a harassment claim with all the reports she's filed against you." By the time Ed filed the response, word had spread. Farmers, local business owners, even folks in town rallied behind Jack. T-shirts started popping up with a silhouette of a tractor and the words, "Mess with the farm, get the fertilizer." Vicky's case fell apart fast. Her insurance company denied her claim after reviewing the drone footage, ruling that she had deliberately parked in an active work zone. Her own HOA started distancing themselves, realizing she had dragged them into a lawsuit they weren't going to win. And then, the final blow came when Commissioner Ray Thompson personally called Jack. "Frank," the commissioner said, voice low but firm, "I've known your family for years. Vicky told me you were creating environmental hazards, but this footage tells a different story. The county won't be entertaining her requests for rezoning." That was the moment Jack knew he'd won. But the real cherry on top. The HOA itself held an emergency vote. Vicky Caldwell was removed as president. And just like that, the woman who had spent 2 years trying to destroy Jack's farm was left with nothing but a manure-covered RAV4 and a reputation so ruined that she had no choice but to leave town. The dust settled, but the story didn't end there. Within a month, Vicky Caldwell and her husband quietly put their house up for sale. No announcements, no goodbyes, just a real estate listing that sat for weeks, the price dropping lower and lower as word of the Manure incident spread far beyond Lakeview Estates. By the time it sold, she had lost nearly $50,000 on the deal, an irony that wasn't lost on the locals. Jack didn't celebrate, at least, not publicly. But it was hard not to smile when he walked into town and saw how the community had rallied behind him. The local diner had a new special on the menu, the Farmer Jack breakfast, a pile of hash browns smothered in brown gravy. The coffee shop started serving a Manure mocha with an extra shot of espresso for that added kick. Even at the hardware store, he spotted more than a few people wearing the now infamous "Mess with the farm, get the fertilizer" t-shirts. The biggest change, though, was in the attitude of the HOA itself. With Vicky gone, the new leadership extended an olive branch, proposing a community farmers market where Jack and other local farmers could sell produce to the very people who had once seen them as a nuisance. The county even passed a new Agricultural Heritage Protection Act, ensuring that farmers like Jack wouldn't be pressured into selling by suburban expansion. One afternoon, Jack watched as a moving truck pulled up to Vicky's old house. A young couple stepped out, their 3 kids piling onto the lawn, running barefoot through the grass. That evening, they knocked on Jack's door, holding a homemade pie. "We heard about the history between the HOA and the farm," the father admitted, a little sheepishly. "We just wanted to introduce ourselves properly. And, we parked on the road. Hope that's okay." Jack chuckled, shaking his hand. "That's just fine." Their 10-year-old son, standing wide-eyed behind his parents, finally blurted out, "Is it true? Did you really bury a car in poop?" Jack smiled. "Not exactly, kid. But I did teach someone an important lesson." The boy thought about it for a second, then grinned. "My teacher says manure helps things grow." "Did it help anything grow on your farm?" Jack leaned against the doorframe, glancing out at his fields, his land, still standing strong despite everything thrown at it. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "It helped grow understanding. And sometimes, that's the most important crop of all." As the family walked back home, Jack let out a long breath, finally feeling the weight lift. He'd won. The farm was still his. And anyone who tried to take it from him again? Well, the cows were always making more fertilizer. What do you think? Did Vicky get what she deserved, or should Jack have handled things differently? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA rules? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.